Imagine being accused of a crime you didn't commit. Imagine being tortured for days by people who were supposed to be your comrade. Now imagine dying alone, without immediate justice, while your tormentors lie to cover up what they did. This is the story of Zulfarhan Osman Zulkarnain. In 2017, Malaysia was shaken by a case so cruel that it stunned the entire nation. The brutal murder of a young naval cadet named Zulfarhan. He was only 21 years old. He came from a humble, close-knit family and was known for being disciplined, respectful, and deeply dedicated to his studies. The kind of young man any mother or father would be proud to raise. From a young age, Zulfarhan dreamed of serving in the Royal Malaysian Navy, and he was on the right path. At 18, he was accepted into the prestigious National Defense University, an achievement that reflected not only his talent, but also his determination. While many young people were distracted by leisure, he focused on studying, training, and becoming an exemplary officer. He was admired by his teachers, respected by his peers, and deeply loved by his family. He seemed destined for a brilliant career. But everything started to change in May 2017 when a classmate, Mohammed Akmal, set off a series of events that would end in tragedy. A laptop had gone missing from the dormitory. Instead of following protocol and alerting university authorities, Akmal chose a darker path. He decided to find the culprit himself. And here, things took a turn as bizarre as they were terrifying. Akmal didn't investigate the missing laptop. Instead, he consulted a bomo, a type of traditional shaman in Malaysian culture. This figure, without any evidence or proof, claimed that Zulfarhan was responsible. There was no investigation, no defense, just an accusation born from so-called spiritual revelation. Based on this absurd claim, Akmal decided that justice had to be served by his own hand, and he didn't act alone. On May 21st, 2017, a group of 18 cadets, led by Akmal, stormed into Zulfarhan's room. What should have been a community grounded in honor and respect turned into a mob of aggressors thirsty for a confession. From that moment on, Zulfarhan's life would never be the same. He was forcibly taken to another dorm room, tied to a bed, and brutally interrogated, all under the false pretense of getting a confession for a crime he didn't. In the days that followed, the violence escalated rapidly. Belts, hoses, hangers, any object became a weapon. Even as Zulfarhan begged for help and insisted on his innocence, the beatings continued. But the worst was yet to come. The group decided that hitting wasn't enough. They began using a clothes iron, heated to the maximum, to burn Zulfarhan's body. They avoided his face and hands in a perverse attempt to hide the signs of torture. But the damage was devastating. Approximately 90 burns were recorded on his body, including on sensitive areas like his buttocks and genital. During this time, Zulfarhan pleaded for help. He begged to go to the hospital. He cried out for them to stop. But no one listened. No one dared to defy the group. Silence prevailed. When his health visibly began to decline, the group chose to hide the severity of the situation. They applied makeshift dressings, kept him hidden in rooms, and started lying to professors and other students about his weight. To make things worse, when they finally took him to a private clinic, they lied again, claiming the injuries were the result of military training. The doctor who saw him was alarmed by the severity of the burns and recommended immediate transfer to a hospital. But once again, the cadets chose to ignore medical advice and took him back to the dormitory. In the following days, his condition became irreversible. The question everyone asks is, how did 18 young men at a prestigious military university turn into torturers? To understand that, we need to go back to the beginning of the conflict. It all started with a missing laptop, a simple object common in any college dorm. Mohammed Akmal, one of Zulfarhan's classmates, felt wronged by the disappearance. But instead of informing university administrators or filing a report, he made a decision that would seal everyone's fate. He turned to a shaman. This figure, known as a bomo, is seen in parts of Malaysia as a spiritual healer, someone who claims to have supernatural powers to reveal hidden truths. He was the one who pointed to Zulfarhan as the supposed thief. No evidence, no investigation, just the word of an esoteric source. And for Akmal, that was enough. Driven by anger or a false sense of justice, Akmal gathered a group of fellow cadets and decided they would extract a confession from Zulfarhan. What followed was a series of brutal decisions that revealed a complete absence of empathy, responsibility, and humanity from them. On May 21st, 2017, The group stormed into Zulfarhan's dorm room while he was sleeping. There was no warning, no dialogue. He was suddenly restrained, beaten, and dragged to another room. That's where the nightmare began. They tied Zulfarhan to the bed using ropes and bedsheets. At first, they pretended to be investigators, asking questions and demanding it. But soon, it gave way to raw violence. Belts were used as whips. Plastic hangers, hoses, even curtain cords became tools of torture. Zulfarhan insisted he was innocent. He repeated that he didn't steal the laptop. He asked them to call the university authorities. He begged to see a doctor, but his cries were drowned out by the group's obsession with vigilante justice. This is where human nature reveals its darkest side. None of the 18 cadets had the courage to stop what was happening. None called for help. None stood up and said it was wrong. On the contrary, some laughed, some encouraged the abuse, and some participated actively in the torture. The violence continued for days. Instead of stopping, they escalated. In an effort to get a confession, which never came, they began using even more extreme methods. The iron was used again and again, heated until it glowed, then pressed into Zulfarhan's skin as he screamed in agony. It's estimated he suffered about 90 burns, mostly on his back, legs, buttocks, and genitals. They carefully avoided his face and hands, fearing that visible injuries would raise suspicion. But the rest of his body was slowly being destroyed. Zulfarhan could no longer eat. He could barely speak. His weakened body was beginning to shut down. Even then, his peers kept hiding him. When someone asked where he was, they said he had gone home to visit, or that he was sick with the flu. This conspiracy of silence was as cruel as the violence itself. For days, no one took him to a hospital. Only on May 27th, nearly a week after the beatings began, did the cadets take him to a private clinic, and even then, they lied about the injury. They told the doctor he had been hurt during a physical training session. The doctor was shocked by what she saw. Severe burns, signs of infection, labored breathing. She urgently recommended immediate hospitalization. But the group's response was once again unbelievable. Instead of taking him to a hospital, they brought him back to the dorm. The doctor had given them a written recommendation. They simply ignored it. At this point, Zulfarhan was in critical condition. His body was riddled with infection, deprived of proper treatment, and without professional care, he was dying slowly. Every passing minute was a death sentence. And the worst part, all of this could have been avoided. By then, Zulfarhan had endured nearly a week of agony. His body, weakened by dozens of burns, infections, and dehydration, was collapsing. Yet even in the midst of the pain, he kept saying the same thing. He was innocent. When they returned from the clinic on May 27th, the group acted as if nothing had happened. They avoided informing the university, hid the doctor's report, and continued providing improvised care, desperately trying to keep the tragedy. They applied ointments, used gauze and tape, but had no medical knowledge. Zulfarhan groaned in pain with every touch. His skin was necrotizing. He could no longer move on his own. In the early hours of June 1st, 2017, after 10 days of beatings, the situation became irreversible. Zulfarhan's heart failed. He stopped breathing. One of his peers tried to revive him. Others called an ambulance, but it was too late. When paramedics arrived at the National Defense University dormitory, he was already dead. It was 10 p.m. Zulfarhan's death was not just the result of torture. It was the product of a deliberate sequence of cruel actions, cowardly omissions, and a conspiracy to hide the truth. The autopsy report was clear and devastating. 90 burns on his body, multiple organ failure, severe systemic infections. Forensic experts stated that even if he had received medical help in the final stages, he might not have survived. But they also said, if he had been treated in the early days, his chances would have been much greater. Zulfarhan's family received the news of his death over the phone. Desperate, his parents rushed to the military hospital where his body had been taken. The shock of seeing their son in that state was something his mother would later describe as unimaginable. The boy she had raised with so much care, who had taken pride in serving his country, had been killed by those who were supposed to be his brothers in arms. Grief quickly turned into public outcry. As the news spread across Malaysia, a wave of outrage gripped the population. How could something like this happen inside a prestigious institution under the supervision of officers and professors? How could such a large group conceal such a brutal crime for days? The police acted swiftly. That same day, 36 cadets were detained for questioning. Of those, 18 were formally charged for their involvement in the assaults. 6 of them, including Akmal, the mastermind behind the false accusation, were charged with murder. The case dominated headlines, public debates, and social media. Zulfarhan's face appeared on newspaper covers and magazine spreads. People marched in protest, demanding justice. The university was heavily criticized for failing to notice the warning signs, for not intervening in time, and for failing to protect its own students. But while the nation grieved, one question loomed: would the system let these young men go unpunished? The pressure from the public and the demand for justice pushed Malaysia's legal system into action. Zulfarhan's case couldn't be treated as just another isolated episode of violence. It had become a national symbol of impunity, abuse of power, and institutional neglect. The trial began in January 2018. The courtroom, filled with journalists, activists, family members, and onlookers, listened to the testimonies with attention and disbelief. The prosecution presented 29 witnesses throughout the proceedings, including doctors, forensic experts, roommates, university staff, and even some of the cadets involved. The details that emerged were harrowing. Medical reports showed that Zulfarhan had not only suffered burns in sensitive areas, but also signs of blunt force trauma, acute malnutrition, and systemic organ failure. Doctors stated that the injuries were completely inconsistent with any kind of military training, as initially claimed by the cadets. It was clear this had been torture. The testimonies also revealed how a culture of fear and hierarchy had prevented many of those involved from reporting what was happening. Some cadets said they felt pressure to take part, feared retaliation, or simply didn't want to get involved. But this collective silence was what allowed the crime to continue for so many days. The prosecution emphasized the central role of Muhammad Akmal, the one who initiated the false accusation and orchestrated the violence. He not only began the torture, but coordinated the others, manipulated information, and oversaw each step of the abuse. During the trial, he remained expressionless, showing no remorse. The 6 cadets charged with murder tried, through their lawyers, to argue that they had no intention of killing Zulfarhan. They claimed they only wanted to obtain a confession and that things got out of hand. This legal strategy proved decisive in the initial verdict. In November 2021, the court found the 6 guilty of culpable homicide, meaning they had caused his death without intent to kill. The sentence: 18 years in prison for each of them. A punishment seen by some as harsh, but by many as lenient. The reaction was immediate. Public opinion, which had followed the case from the start, was divided. On one side, some were relieved the perpetrators were at least being held accountable. On the other, many felt the sentence didn't reflect the cruelty of the crime. In an emotional interview after the verdict, Zulfarhan's mother said, "They took my son's life like it was nothing, and now they'll walk out of prison still young, with time to start over." Zulfarhan doesn't have that chance. Despite the convictions, the case was far from over. The public prosecutor's office appealed the decision, arguing that the facts clearly pointed to intentional murder. At the same time, human rights groups, student organizations, and even politicians began debating reforms to the disciplinary system of military academies. The case had exposed not just individual failures, but a deeply rooted culture of silence, fear, and authoritarianism that needed to be addressed. The university where it all happened also underwent change. Internal committees were created, officers were suspended, and new policies were introduced to prevent future abuses. But for Zulfarhan's family, no measure could fill the void he left behind. His story became a symbol. On social media, hashtags like #JusticeForZulfarhan and #RememberZulfarhan went viral. Videos explaining the case reached millions of views. Young people who had never known him began using his name as a rallying cry in protest for justice and dignity. The trial had ended, but the pursuit of justice had not. After the 18-year prison sentence, many believed Zulfarhan's case was closed. But Malaysia's judicial system had one final twist in store. On June 23, 2024, the Court of Appeals issued a bombshell ruling. It overturned the conviction for culpable homicide and reinstated the original charge of intentional murder. The judges stated there was sufficient evidence that the perpetrators were fully aware of the consequences of their action. Burning someone repeatedly with a hot iron over several days was not an accident. It was a conscious, brutal, and potentially lethal act. With this new classification, the sentence changed drastically. The 6 main perpetrators were sentenced to death by hanging, as stipulated in Malaysian law. The announcement hit like a bombshell. Some celebrated it as a strong stance against impunity. But others, particularly international human rights groups, condemned the use of capital punishment. The families of the accused were devastated. They filed appeals, organized protests, and pleaded for clemency. They argued that while the young men had made a terrible mistake, they didn't deserve to die for it, that they had already served time and were remorseful. The pressure was so intense that the case reached the highest court in the country, the Federal Court of Malaysia. And on February 28, 2025, the final decision was delivered. In a highly anticipated ruling, the judges revoked the death sentences and reinstated the original conviction, 18 years in prison for the 6 involved. Their justification was that, while the crime was heinous, it lacked the element of premeditation required for the death penalty. This decision was met with relief by some, outrage by others. Zulfarhan's family remained silent on the day of the ruling, but days later, his mother gave an interview that moved millions. She revealed that even after all those years, none of the perpetrators had apologized. Not during the trial, not afterward. No letters, no gestures of regret. For her, that was the most painful part. They erased my son's life and never looked back, she said. She also spoke of forgiveness. She said that in her heart, she held no hatred, but she couldn't find justice in sentences unaccompanied by remorse. Justice is not just punishment. It's acknowledgement of the pain they caused. Her words touched the nation. Many began to see Zulfarhan's case not only as a story of brutality, but as a call for empathy, respect for life, and collective responsibility. It wasn't just about punishing 6 individuals. It was about confronting the kind of society that allows young people to torture another based on an unproven suspicion. Today, Zulfarhan's name lives on as a warning. In Malaysian military institutions, new student protection protocols have been introduced. Ethics and conduct training sessions are now mandatory. And more importantly, his story is being told in classrooms, documentaries, and across social media. In universities, students speak of Zulfarhan as a martyr, someone who lost his life not because of a crime, but because of the cowardice of those who chose silence. His case has led to laws, reflection, and perhaps a more conscious generation. The case also reignited debates about the death penalty in Malaysia. The government has faced pressure to reconsider its use, and although it still exists, cases like Zulfarhan's help put into perspective the weight of such a final decision. Zulfarhan never got to fulfill his dream of serving in the Royal Navy. He never graduated, never built a career, never had a family. But his story impacted an entire country. And if there is a way to honor his memory, it is by making sure no other life is taken through neglect, silence, or cruelty. If you made it this far, please share this video so more people can learn about Zulfarhan. And if this content touched you in any way, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and help us continue to tell stories that deserve to be. Zulfarhan's case exposed one of the most complex and disturbing issues in any hierarchical institution, the culture of silence. More than physical brutality, more than the criminal decisions of a few, what truly sustained this tragedy was collective omission. For days, dozens of people knew, or at least suspected, that something was wrong, and no one said anything. Why does this happen? The answer isn't simple. In military, academic, or corporate environments, there's often an idea of brotherhood that, while seemingly noble, often turns into complicity. Reporting a peer is seen as betrayal. Questioning a superior's order, even if it's wrong, is seen as weakness. The fear of being excluded, losing privileges, or facing retaliation becomes greater than the moral responsibility to. In Zulfarhan's case, this culture was laid bare. Witnesses testified that they heard screams, knew about the burns, noticed his absence. But they chose silence. Some because they didn't want to get involved. Others because they didn't think it was that serious. And, sadly, some simply didn't care. It's painful to admit, but these behaviors aren't unique to Malaysia. All over the world, stories of hidden violence, institutional bullying, and abuse of power repeat themselves, precisely because so many people look the other way. Because it's easier not to see. Because the discomfort of acting seems greater than the discomfort of doing nothing. But there is always a cost. And in Zulfarhan's case, that cost was the life of a promising young, someone who could have been saved if, at any point, Just one person had said, "This is wrong." Silence has weight and consequences. In response to this kind of culture, many countries have adopted whistleblower protection policy, laws that ensure anonymity and legal safety for those brave enough to break the cycle of abuse. But more than laws, what's needed is a change in mindset. We must educate young people to understand that loyalty is not accepting wrongdoing, that courage isn't following the majority, but doing what's right, that integrity demands action, not just opinion. In schools, companies, and academies, it's vital to have safe reporting channels. Victims and witnesses must know they will be heard, and those who act correctly must be protected, not punished. In Zulfarhan's case, many of those mechanisms failed. The university did not foster an environment where students felt safe to speak up. Superiors didn't catch the warning sign. The culture of blind obedience silenced every attempt at resistance. But there is hope. Since the case, changes have begun. Educational programs were launched. Codes of conduct were rewritten. Zulfarhan's name became not just a symbol of justice, but of collective responsibility. It's essential that his memory not be used to fuel hatred, but to inspire change. That his story pushes young people to say no when faced with abuse. That it serves as a warning to those who think staying silent is neutral. Because in the end, silence is never neutral. It always protects the abuser.